Welcome to the City Council special meeting this Monday evening, January 12th. City Clerk, may you please call the roll?
Certainly, Mayor Lorraine. Councilmember Diaz-Nash?
Yes.
Councilmember Svirko-Goditsky?
Here.
Deputy Mayor Fernandez?
Here.
Mayor Lorraine?
Here.
And Councilmember Newsom?
Here.
Thank you. I'll just ask city colleagues and staff to please silence and turn off your phones and devices for the meeting going forward. Welcome. We are excited to be here in person with options for those who choose not to be in person to still participate virtually. This meeting is being held at the San Mateo Main Public Library due to the construction at City Hall. I'd like to share a few logistical reminders to help our meeting here run smoothly. So for those in the room, please note that after 8 o'clock, the library closes. Staff asks that everyone exit through the back doors behind the seating here, located directly behind the room. With regard to parking at the library, after 8 o'clock p.m., the stairwell to the parking garage is locked. Attendees will need to use the elevator and select level P1 or P2 to access the garage. And that would be outside. So you still go out this way and there's an elevator, just know that the stairwell is locked. Zoom attendees, please check your microphone volume before participating in public comment. We have MCTV here tonight helping us out, and they will continue monitoring audio to ensure that there is clear sound for all participants. Thank you to MCTV. And thank you all for your cooperation and for helping us maintain an efficient and accessible meeting environment. There are several ways to participate. For those attending in person, you can complete a yellow request to speak slip and hand it to the city clerk. If participating remotely, you can use the raise your hand feature in Zoom, and you will be called on at the appropriate time when we have public comment periods for items. If you're calling in via phone, please press *9 to raise your hand, and then when you're called upon, you can press *6 to unmute. These options for public comment will remain available until I close public comment period for each specific item. If you're joining us via YouTube, members of the public watching on YouTube, if you wish to provide live comment, unfortunately we don't currently have that functionality within YouTube. We just have it through Zoom. So please join the meeting through the Zoom webinar using the access information listed on the agenda. So if you go to our website, cityofsanmateo.org, and find our meeting there, the Zoom link information is in the agenda. Thank you for your patience with that. Now we will move on to our study session item for the special meeting, potential ballot measures for November 2026, survey results, and council direction. We have a presentation from Mr. Zachary Rita, Senior Management Analyst with the City Manager's Office. Mr. Rita, please.
Good evening, Mayor, City Council. My name is Zach Rada, Senior Management Analyst, and we are joined virtually tonight by Timothy McClarney, President of True North Research. The purpose of our study session tonight is staff is seeking direction from Council on whether to proceed with education and outreach on a potential ballot measure. And also, it's an opportunity to receive a report from True North Research and Timothy on a survey that was conducted, and it will help identify the features of the measures that resonate with voters. So here are the 4 options for City Council consideration. Number 1, should the city proceed with education and outreach on the sales tax measure and return to Council for decision whether to place it on the November 2026 ballot. Number 2, same language except swap sales tax measure for general obligation bond. Number 3, both sales tax measure and general obligation bond. And number 4 is should the city not proceed with education and outreach on either the sales tax measure or the general obligation bond. So just quickly, some background on how we got to today. In June of 25, the budget was approved with a structural deficit, and To respond to that, in August of 2025, the City Council met and reviewed the revenue measure options and provided direction to continue exploring bond and sales tax feasibility for the November 26 election. That was the direction that staff and True North Research needed to begin designing and ultimately conducting a revenue measure feasibility study, which was conducted in November of 25. And that really focused on the bond and the sales tax measure. And then just last week, the City Council Ad Hoc Subcommittee met and recommended to continue educating and informing the community about the potential quarter-cent sales tax measure. At this time, I'll pass it over to Timothy to provide the results of the revenue measure feasibility study.
Great. Thank you, Zach. And just want to make sure you've got my audio on that end.
Yes, sir.
Okay,
Yes.
great. Well, good evening, Mayor and members of council. Tim McClarney, President of True North Research. We're a firm that for about 25 years has specialized in working with cities as well as other public agencies around the state and using surveys to help them develop a statistically reliable understanding of the communities and the customers that they serve. One of the areas we really specialize in is revenue measure feasibility studies, like what we're going to be talking about here tonight, where the goal is to understand if it's feasible to move forward with some type of revenue measure, and if it is feasible, to use the research to help guide how you might go about structuring that measure in a way that's going to be consistent with the type of measures that your community is interested in supporting. So I've got some slides here I'm going to walk through. If you have questions or comments along the way, feel free to jump in, and I'll also obviously be available to answer questions on the back of the presentation as well. So before we get into the results, helpful to take a quick moment to review the purpose of the study as well as the methodology. As a revenue measure feasibility study, we're really trying to address the three bullets that you see here. The first is to answer that basic question of, is it feasible? And what I mean by that is, if you as a council were to take the action of placing a measure on an upcoming ballot, does it have a reasonable chance of success? When we do find that it's feasible, the second bullet kicks in gear, which is to use the research to help understand how might you go about structuring a measure in a way that it's consistent with the type of measure that your community is interested in supporting. There's a lot of components to a revenue measure of any stripe, whether it's be a bond or a sales tax. It's, how much is this going to cost me? What types of services or improvements would be funded by the measure? What types of accountability provisions might be built into the measure, et cetera. So there's a lot of important questions that you as a council would ultimately need to answer before you placed a measure on the ballot, and the research can help guide those helping you with those answers. And then thirdly, the research is an opportunity for us to understand how information ultimately shapes voters' opinions about your proposal, and that in turn can help guide city communications. Next slide, please. So in terms of the methodology or how we went about conducting the study, we use the same methodology here that we always use when we're doing revenue measure feasibility studies. And the first thing we want to ask ourselves is, what election environment do we anticipate that this measure is going to be on? The reason for that is different elections have different turnouts, and as you expand or shrink turnout, you can get a somewhat different profile to the participating voters in that election. In this case, we're looking at a potential November 2026 measure, and so we identified all of the individuals in the city that we are known as likely November voters based on when they registered to vote in the community, as well as elections they've taken advantage since that point. And we used a process called stratified and clustered random sampling to choose a representative sample of these likely November voters for our survey. By using stratified and clustered random sampling, what it ensures is at the end of this process, we have a sample that matches the November universe on all of the dimensions that tend to drive how voters behave when it comes to revenue measures. So the balance by age and gender, partisanship, household party type, where they live within the community, the balance in our sample matches the balance in that likely November universe. And that's really one of the keys to making sure that this research is reliable. Once we pulled our sample, we used 3 different recruiting methods: email, text, and telephone. Everything's PIN protected so that only those individuals who were randomly sampled and sent an invitation to participate in the survey could do so. They can complete the survey one time only. They had the option of taking it either online or by telephone, as well as in English or Spanish, whichever was their preference. We had actually set out and were contracted to do 600 completed interviews. We walked back in the door with over 1,000. The reason for that is I always have to make some estimates about what do I think the productivity and response rate is going to be to the survey in a community. I tend to err on the more conservative side. Here, we just got a much better response to the invitations than I was anticipating. And the benefit of that is we have about an extra 400 interviews to play with, which is great because one of the things we're doing in this study is what's called a split sample study, where because we're looking at a potential bond measure as well as a potential sales tax measure, research has shown that you want to split your samples so that half get one version, half get the other. That's the best way to get a clean read on the potential support for each one of those measures. And so we took our 1,012 interviews, split them in half. And what that means is that for questions that were answered by all 1,012 respondents, we have a margin of error due to sampling of plus or minus 3% at the 95% confidence level. But even when we split it in half, and so those questions that are specific to a bond or specific to a sales tax, we still have a margin of error that meets the academic standard for statistical reliability, which is plus or minus, in this case, 4.3% at the 95% confidence level. So what this basically means is whether we're looking at a bond or a sales tax related questions, we can be 95% confident that the results in our survey are within 4.3% of what we would have found had we spoken with all of your likely November voters. Okay, so with that, next slide, we jump into the results. We like to open up the revenue measure feasibility studies with a few warm-up questions that kind of get folks thinking about their community before we get to the issue of the revenue measure itself. And so the first question in this series simply asks them to tell us how they would rate the overall quality of life in the community. Would they say it's excellent, good, fair, poor, or very poor? As you can see here on the slide, we've got 86% of respondents who rated the overall quality of life in the city as excellent or good. This is actually a really positive result with respect to a revenue measure. We tend to find that, and I get to do this work around the state for a lot of different communities, we tend to find that in the communities where voters have a high opinion of the quality of life in their community already, that they are more inclined to support revenue measures that are geared around maintaining that level of quality of life, maintaining the services that they've been accustomed to receiving. And so good result there. On the next slide, we presented an open-ended question where we said, if the city could change one thing to make San Mateo a better place to live, what change would you like to see? This was asked in an open-ended manner, meaning we didn't provide them with the list of options you see here on the slide. They got to just tell us in their own words. We went back and looked at the verbatim responses and grouped them into the categories you see here. So the number one response there is not sure, can't think of anything at 11%. And if you look a little further down the list, you also see about 5% of folks who said no changes, everything is fine. So you've got about 16% of voters who, when you hand them a soapbox and say, step up on that soapbox and tell us one thing we can do to make the quality of life in the community better, they're kind of stuck for an answer, right? And that in some ways is the ideal answer to this question, because they really just don't see any pressing need to make changes in the community. Among the specific responses we did receive, however, you had about 11% who requested more affordable housing in the community. You had another 11% who said limiting growth and preserving open space was the thing that they'd most like to see, and then followed by reducing traffic congestion at 10% and on down. And then on the next slide, we asked our last warm-up question, where we simply asked whether, generally speaking, they are satisfied or dissatisfied with the job the city of San Mateo is doing in providing municipal services. Because we're asking them to speak about the city's performance overall, right? We're not diving into specific areas like streets and roads or public safety. This can be thought of as an overall performance rating for the city. And you see that you've got about three out of four voters say that they were satisfied with the city's efforts to provide municipal services. You've got about 18% who were dissatisfied, with the remainder being not sure, preferring not to answer. So to give you a sense of where this lands in the range of possibilities, for those cities that are getting the top scores on this question, it's kind of high 80s these days. And then I have cities that are in the 40s. So to be at 3/4 or 75% of voters saying that they're satisfied with your performance overall, that's a good solid score. Okay, so next slide. So after those warm-up questions, we get right down to business with what we call the initial ballot test. And the idea behind the initial ballot test is we want to, before we get any deeper into this discussion with a respondent and start talking about possible tax rates or how the funds could be spent in more detail, or presenting arguments pro and con related to this proposal, we wanted to present to respondents a mock-up of what we think that 75-word ballot statement could look like and get their reaction. The initial ballot test is a really good gauge of where your voters are at on the natural with respect to a proposal, because they haven't seen anything at this point beyond what you're seeing here on the slide. This is the ballot language for the bond, and it takes the form of a legally compliant bond ballot statement. And so you can see in a bonds are only for capital, right? So they can do things like pave and maintain local streets, fix potholes, repair, public buildings, things like that. They aren't for services. And we had set this bond at a total authorized amount of $323 million, which would have a tax rate of $30 per 100,000 of assessed valuation. So that's the bond ballot language. On the next slide, same exercise here, only this is for those 50% of respondents who received the sales tax version. You can see the sales tax version's a little different in terms of the language. It can reference both bonds as well as services. And this takes the form of what we call a general tax, meaning the funds are not earmarked for any one particular purpose. They will go into the general fund, and it's up to council to decide how you would spend those things. But the bullets here give a good idea of the things that you do fund out of the general fund. This was set at a 1/4 cent sales tax. That is the remaining increment that is below the cap for your city. It would provide about $7 million annually for general government use. So those were the two ballot statements we tested. And here are the results. You can see on the left side there, the bond, we had 59% support for that proposal, 26% opposed, with the remainder being unsure. On the right is the sales tax. Support initially was a little softer for the sales tax. We had 53% support, 38% opposed, and the rest unsure. Now, one of the important things to keep in mind, however, is that a bond and a general sales tax do not play on the same playing field. A bond requires 2/3 support from participating voters to be successful, or basically 66.6667%. And so at this initial ballot test, we're sitting about 8% below that 2/3 threshold, right, for the bond. So we're underwater by about 8%. The general sales tax, on the other hand, plays on a simple majority playing field. And so what that means is we need 50% plus one vote to be successful. So even though the initial support for the sales tax is softer, we're actually operating about 3 points above the threshold that's required for passage for that option. So it's important to keep in mind as we go through this presentation, the fact that the threshold for passage of the bond is quite a bit higher, 17 points higher than the threshold required for the general sales tax. Next slide, please. So for the bond, we wanted to also dig in to see how tax rate sensitive voters are with respect to this proposal. And so naturally, kind of the higher the price tag for a bond, all other things being equal, the lower the level of support you can expect. And so we did that in a couple different ways. In this first slide here, we focused on the tax rate that would be associated with the measure. And we tested 3 different tax rates. At the top was that $30 per 100,000 of assessed valuation tax rate that was built into that initial ballot test 75-word ballot statement. If they were anything but a definitely yes at the $30 per 100,000 assessed, we asked 20 and 15. And you can see here a couple of things. Number one, the moment you kind of put the blinders on somebody and you focus their attention on the tax rate that could be associated with a bond, it has a bit of a chilling effect on support for the proposal. So at that initial ballot test, we had 59% support with a $30 tax rate embedded in that 75-word ballot statement. Here, when we pull the $30 tax rate out and set it aside and focus voters' attention on it, support drops dramatically. We're now at 45%. As you then lower that tax rate from 30 to 20 and then 20 to 15, you can see that we're getting incremental adjustments in support. But even at the $15 per 100,000 assessed valuation tax rate, we only had 55% of voters say that they would support this proposal. That's about 12 points south of the 2/3 threshold that's required for passage. Now, one of the things we know about this question is it tends to be a conservative read on support for a bond. The reason being, when you talk about the tax implications of a bond in terms of a rate per 100,000 of assessed valuation, not everybody knows what you're talking about, right? You have to know what assessed valuation means. You have to have some reasonable estimate of the AV for your property. You've got to do math pretty quickly in the space of a poll to turn that rate into a meaningful number. Not everybody's good at that. And so we know that there's a certain percentage of voters who, when you present it this way, they know you're talking price tag, they don't know what it adds up to, and they'll hedge. They'll say, no, we're not sure. So that's why on the next slide, we come about it a different way. You say, all right, let me put it another way. If you knew that this measure would cost the typical homeowner about $225 per year, would you vote yes or no? The $225 per year is the $30 per 100,000 of assessed valuation tax rate multiplied times the median AV for residential property in your community. So those two numbers are comparable. And you can see that when you go ahead and do the math, you do tend to get a more positive response to that amount, right? When we tested the $30 tax rate, we were sort of in the mid 40s in support. When you go ahead and do the math and translate that into a $225 per year for the median homeowner, support goes up to 53%. But here again, we're still well below the 2/3 threshold that's required for a bond to pass. Next slide, please. So at this point in the poll, we go into what we call the projects and services section, and the idea here is really twofold. One is we're now going to start to educate respondents more about what these measures could accomplish than we can possibly glean from the 75-word ballot statement, right? In the 75 words, only about half of those words can be devoted to describing what the measure will accomplish. Here, we get to unpack your measures into all these various potential uses. And in that way, voters are getting a better idea about what the proposals are about. The other thing it allows us to do is to look at, of all the ways you could potentially spend the money, how do voters feel about each of these ways and which of these are ultimately their priorities? And as you look at this list, first thing that sort of jumps out is every single item on this list has at least 2/3 of voters say they would favor spending some of the money on that item. So there's nothing on this list that is what I would call unpopular, right? Like voters just don't see the merit of the service and aren't enthused about raising their taxes to fund it. That said, you can kind of see a natural break here where, the top 7 projects test higher favorability overall and more intense favorability. And what you do see here is it's sort of a mix of public works and public safety, right? And some of these items, the ones that are flagged sales tax, so the number 1 item, the number 3 item, the number 5 item, these are items that can be funded by a sales tax. They can't be funded by a bond because they're service oriented. So overall, again, a strong mix of public safety and public works among the top rated projects. So if you as a council ultimately choose to move forward with a measure in 2026, there's going to be an election cycle. During that election cycle, there's going to be a lot of discussion and debate in the community about this proposal, right? You'll have advocates of the measure going out and talking to their friends and neighbors and telling them why this is needed and why they should vote yes. You might also get some opponents, right, who step up and say, this is a terrible idea. We shouldn't be doing it. And here's why. For this survey to be a reliable gauge of the feasibility of a potential revenue measure, we need to simulate that discussion and debate in the space of the poll, so we understand not only where are your voters on the natural, which was that initial ballot test, but what happens to their support for these proposals once they hear positive arguments and once they hear negative arguments. So we do that by first testing positive arguments. You can see here on this slide, the nature of the question is supporters of the measure say blank. You insert a positive argument. Do you think this is a very convincing, somewhat convincing, or not at all convincing reason to support the proposal? And what you see is, a lot of these positive arguments resonate. Towards the top of the list, though, it's interesting. I've found in just the last election cycle that if you can just add a little specificity to some of these arguments, it can make a big difference, right? So it's to talk generally about the fact that you need to maintain roads and you have a lot of sewers and storm drain pipes and parks to maintain will get you a certain reaction. When you can actually quantify and say the city maintains 200 miles of streets, 90 miles of sewer and storm drain pipes, and 31 parks, suddenly it kind of puts into perspective the scale and the magnitude of what you as a city have to maintain. And it really sort of catapults this message from being kind of a lukewarm positive argument into being one of your stronger positive arguments. So you can see here we got a lot of positive arguments. They get traction. Now, at this point in the poll, voters have now heard more about these proposals than they did initially, right? Subsequent to the initial ballot test on the bond, we talked about the possible tax rates that could be associated with the bond. We, in both cases, had the chance to convey more details about how the funds could be spent. We've also conveyed positive arguments. We have not conveyed negatives. So on the next slide, we check in with what we call the interim ballot test. We present the same 75 words, and we ask, now that you've heard a bit more, where do you stand? You can see at this point, we're in a dead heat between these two measures. The bond, support for the bond actually ticked down a point, right? So we're now at 58%. However, support for the sales tax has increased 5 points, and we're now at 58%. So even though we're tied in terms of the level of support for the respective measures, here again, the playing fields aren't even. We're still about 9 points lower than the 2/3 threshold that's required for passage for a bond. Meanwhile, we're 8 points north of the simple majority threshold that's required for the sales tax option. And then next slide. And then we get to the negatives. So the idea behind the negatives is I want to pressure test voter support for this proposal by peppering them with a series of negative arguments, the kind of opposition arguments they might encounter during an election cycle, so that we have an understanding of, should you get opposition? Should they be vocal and get their message out there? How much impact would that have potentially on voter support for your proposal? So we tested a series of negative arguments. You can see here at the top of the list, the top 3 all have to do with what we think is probably going to be the dominant theme of this upcoming election, which is affordability, right? Everyone's sensitive to cost of living and affordability issues. And all the top 3 here kind of focus on that from one angle or another. So we see that the negatives do get some traction. The real question, though, is what happens afterwards, and that is the next slide. So after the negatives, what we see is the bond cools down to 54% at this point. So we are a full 13 points below the 2/3 threshold, whereas the sales tax cools down less, and we're landing at 56%, which is 6 points north of the simple majority that's required for passage. And so one of the interesting patterns in this poll is the bond starts higher, and the more people are learning about the proposal, it tends to trail in a downward direction. Meanwhile, support for the sales tax winds up ending the survey higher than it began. Next slide, please. So I've got a couple wrap-up slides on the polling that I'll share, and then I'll kick it back over to Zach. So what does all this mean? I'm going to circle back to that overarching question I mentioned at the outset as the main motivator for why we do this research, which is to answer that question of, is it feasible? What I mean by that is, if you as a council choose to place a measure on the ballot, does it have a reasonable chance of success in November? I think the answer to that question really depends on which measure we're talking about. Based on these polling results, we do not see that a bond is feasible. At no point do we have enough support to where I feel comfortable thinking that you're going to be able to achieve a 2/3 threshold in November. The general sales tax, on the other hand, is a different story. I think that is a feasible measure, right? I think there's a path forward for a winnable measure. Why is that? Well, it's all the things that you see under the bullets there for positive signs for the sales tax. We saw that right out of the gates with just that 75-word ballot statement. We had sufficient natural support. We need simple majority. We had 53%. And we also saw that as voters learned more about that sales tax measure, support for that option grew, right? That wasn't the case with the bond. It was the case with the sales tax. All of the sort of projects and services that you can fund with a sales tax were popular. We've got positive arguments that resonate. And importantly, at each point in the poll where we circled back to a respondent and said, now that you've heard a bit more, where do you stand on these measures? At every one of those ballot tests for the sales tax, it was above that simple majority required for passage, and that was even after opposition arguments. And so when we see that sort of combination of things, those pieces to the puzzle in place, that's what we want to see to be able to feel comfortable that you've got a measure that could be winnable on election day. That said, there's also some challenges that come out of this poll that I think we really want to be sober-eyed about. One is the receptiveness to potential opposition arguments. We did see that, should you get opposition, we saw that was going to carve off a bit of the support for either proposal, but more so for the bond, less so for the sales tax, but there was an impact there. We want to be thoughtful about the electoral environment in which we're heading into. This coming election is going to be hyper-partisan, like the last few have been, and that can have an impact as you get closer to election day. The campaigning, the partisan campaigning sort of hits high gear. That can cause a little bit of a change in how some voters might view your measure. There might also and probably will be competing measures on the ballot, so you won't be the only thing on the ballot. And then finally, there are these unknowns, and they're sort of unknown in the sense that, we are currently living with tariffs. It's having a certain impact on inflation. It's having a certain impact on the economy overall. We don't know what the next 9 months is going to hold, right? But these are not totally unknowns. I mean, we are living in this environment now. The question is whether things get a little better or a little worse. And obviously, you have these other measures that could be on the ballot. So all of these things are things that, depending on how they play out, can create a little adversity for your measure. I bring them up not because I think these are insurmountable challenges. They're just a reminder that when we move forward with a measure, we want to put a measure on the ballot that can withstand some of these headwinds, right? We want to put a measure on the ballot that we aren't crossing our fingers and holding our breath and hoping that we've got great weather on election day. We want to put a measure up there that's squarely in the sort of space that voters have said that they'd want to see, and this measure be and focused on particular services and improvements. I think if we do that, we're in a good position. Next slide, please. So although you've got promising results with respect to the sales tax, it's important to keep in mind that a survey like this is not a crystal ball looking forward to election day saying you're going to get 53 or 59% on election day. It's a snapshot in time, right? It tells us where your voters are today. It tells us how they are likely to react to the types of information they can encounter during the election cycle. But ultimately, what happens on election day isn't based on what your poll says today. It's based on everything that happens from this point forward, right? So it's a kind of a reminder that we need to make smart decisions about the measure that you put in front of voters so that it's well aligned with the kind of measure that they've said that they are interested in supporting. And you got to put the work in terms of communications. So under the category of smart decisions, I would just point out a couple things. Number one, as a general sales tax, although there are 2 elections in our near future, we've got the primary in June as well as the general election in November. One of the conditions of having a general tax is that it needs to appear on that upcoming November ballot. It's not an option for June. I also like the November turnout being higher anyways, and so I think that's the date to be focusing on. From a tax rate perspective on the sales tax, I would keep it at the 1/4 cent. That keeps you under the cap. It brings you up to the cap of the total combined sales tax rate. And so I would stay there. In terms of funding priorities, everything, that we tested was popular, and it's important to keep in mind that a general tax does not earmark the funds for any particular purpose. But that said, from your general fund, you fund all the things you see there under that bullet, and that's kind of the things that voters indicated they're most interested in supporting. That's a combination of public works and public safety. And then from a moving forward standpoint, there's really 2 paths of communication to be thinking about. There's the non-advocacy communications that the city can do, right? Just providing voters with basic information that helps build awareness of what your service needs are, your capital funding needs, and start to build consensus on a proposal. Ultimately, there would also have to be an independent campaign, private dollars not funded by the city, that could actually go out and advocate for this measure during the election cycle. And one more thing I want to point out is when we started this process, we were looking at potentially a bond as well as a sales tax. One of the things that's important to keep in mind about these sales taxes, there's a cap, right, on the rate that is allowed. There's a max sales tax rate that's allowed in any county, and there's only a 1/4% left in that within your city. And so there's this 1/4 cent sales tax that's there. Now, you as a city can go with a measure and claim that, in which case those dollars will stay local, right? The sales tax revenue from that measure would stay local and it would be controlled by the city. If the city doesn't take it and another, say, region-wide or county-wide agency does, that effectively will lock the city out of being able to go for that in the future, right? Once that quarter cent is taken, it is no longer available. And so you have sort of a limited time, sort of opportunity here to be able to go grab that. I'm not sure what other agencies are going to do, but obviously at some point that would be claimed. So I think with that, I'll hand it back to Zach.
Thank you. So yeah, just quickly, some next steps. So if the council decides to move forward with option 1, 2, or 3, staff will engage in an educational outreach effort to inform the community about the potential ballot measure. We'll work with True North Research to conduct a tracking survey in the spring or early summer of 2026 so we can get more information about likely voters and their feelings towards the revenue measure. We'll also develop draft ballot language, and then lastly, report back to the council on the survey results and ask for final direction on whether to place the measure on the ballot. That would likely happen in July of 2026. And it's important to note, like Timothy mentioned, that once the council, if the council does decide to put the measure on the ballot, then after that point, the city can no longer spend city resources or staff time on community outreach. So last slide here. Here are the 4 options. It's really move forward with education and outreach on a sales tax measure, a general obligation bond, both, or neither. And with that, I'll pass it back to the mayor. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rada and Mr. McQuarney. At this point, I'd like to open for public comment on this item. If you are in the room and have a speaker slip, you can hand it to the city clerk at this time. If you're on Zoom, please raise your hand. Mr. City Clerk, how many speakers do we have?
Certainly, Mayor Lorraine, if you are in our virtual environment, please raise your hand if you wish to speak on this item. We will be calling the last speaker, so we'll give you just a few moments to do so. Mayor Lorraine, we have a total of 3 requests to speak. We have 2 in person, and our final speaker on this item will be Thomas Morgan. We'll begin with our in-person request to speak. If you are participating in person, we have a podium in the center of our room here. Please speak directly into the microphone. And we will begin with Michael Reagan. And using council-adopted rules and procedures, we will set the time limit at 3 minutes per speaker.
Is this working? Yes, working. Now, it's not often I have ever spoke down to you. I guess we're speaking down. Usually I'm looking up at you. Happy New Year to all of you. That was a great presentation. I'm not too thrilled with consultings, the amount of money that we spend on consulting fees. I've seen many of those spent over the many years, and it seems to add up to a lot of things we could do, like we need a roof at our library and our senior center. I think that money could be better spent because I think a lot of this stuff we already know. And I think what you should do is put this thing in a binder, and whenever you want to do a bond or sales tax, I think this pretty much tells you everything you're going to know for many years, because I don't think it's going to change too much. My point, I guess, from his speech, not wanting a bond measure, I think that's important. My big question was not just the cost of a bond at $323 million, but the actual repayment of it. I think it's almost doubled. So I think we're looking at almost $600 million to repay a bond. So I think that's a lot of money that should be explained to people. On the sales tax, I didn't know that before. If we don't take it, it's gone. The problem with that is we seem to be losing a lot of our sales tax revenue in my community. We're losing them all. I see nothing but businesses closing around. A lot of the development that we had that you approved for density and height, Safeway store, Lucky stores, and those sort of things for redevelopment, we could be losing a lot of the money that would give us the ability to have a sales tax. So it seems to be we're going in the wrong direction. We want a sales tax, but we're losing so much revenue with the loss of so many retail establishments. I guess my last point would be that I do believe because of the what I've read, that the school is proposing a bond. Our state has a $2 billion deficit, and then your guys going to put on either a bond or a sales tax. I think it's the wrong time to try to ask people, because I think they're all going to fail. I think there's going to be quite a few of these either bonds or taxes coming up in 26. I think we should look hard before we start spending a lot of time and money trying to get a tax for this year. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Our next speaker will be Dana Sahai.
Hi, Council. I'm against asking taxpayers to pay another tax. We've already been asked to pass Measure CC, the flood and storm protection fee, and now this. There seems to be a pattern of asking for money every 2 years, and I'm concerned that a sales tax won't raise as much money as anticipated, since retail continues to shrink in San Mateo. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. Thank you.
Thank you. Moving to our virtual environment, where our first and only speaker will be Thomas Morgan. Thomas, please go ahead and unmute your mic.
Hello, can you hear me?
It's a little faint. If you wouldn't mind speaking just a little bit louder.
Hi. 1 second, let me try to get on my...
Sorry, Thomas, we're not hearing you quite well. If you wouldn't mind speaking just a little bit louder. No, Thomas, we're not hearing you at all at this time. If you're continuing to speak, you may be having some technical issues. Mayor Lorraine, it looks like we're unable to hear our final public commenter. So at this time, we will close public comment. Before we go to council comments, we are experiencing some technical difficulties at the moment, so some of our virtual attendees are having some difficulty hearing us. So if you could please speak directly into the microphone as you're providing your comments, that would be appreciated.
Okay, I will try my best to do that, and thank you for the update, and I'm sorry to Thomas, but at least I know that Thomas frequently contributes and can email us his thoughts for what it's worth. At this time, I would like to ask if any of my council colleagues have any questions. Councilmember Spiro-Kukuditsky.
Thank you, through the mayor. I'm wondering if we can call our finance director, Abby, up here to answer a few questions. Primarily, my question is if you could explain to the public about the current city deficit and what the potential impacts would be if we didn't have a sales tax measure or bond measure. Thank you.
Great, sure. And we will be talking about that also when we come back for the mid-year budget adjustments in February, at the February 20th meeting. So we'll be going into depth more. But at this time, we'll talk about the kind of current deficit that we've been talking about. When we came to adopt our budget for fiscal year 25-26, we had a budget deficit of $12 million with our revenue estimates and our expenditures. After that, we also heard that we did not get the full VLF shortfall that we were due for 25-26. So that's another $2 million that right now will not be coming in revenues. So that increased our deficit to $14 million. So what we're looking for is we do think that with salary savings and some expenditure savings, we can hopefully get that down to a lower amount. But given that we're seeing about $5 to $7 million in deficit kind of on an annual basis, we're looking to an ongoing revenue source to kind of help meet that demand, because expenses are continuing, as everybody's been talking about, and our revenues are growing. They're just not growing as fast as expenses are at this point.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I think that's it for me. I just appreciate the clarification.
Very good. Councilmember Newsom.
Through the mayor, thank you. Okay, these questions I'm going to direct towards True North, and then if need to, we can ask the staff as well. The first question is, of the 1,012 interviewees, do we know with certainty or relative certainty that these are San Mateo City residents that are voters within the city?
You're on mute.
Tim, you're on mute.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Right as you were speaking, I heard a sneeze, and so I missed part of
Sure,
what
no
you
problem.
had.
Well, you have a great turnout with 1,012 interviewees and a city population of about 110,000. So I was curious, do we know?
Everything just froze.
Can you hear me?
I'm sorry, it just froze. Now, one more time.
Okay. You have a great turnout with the number of interviewees you have with 1,012. I was curious, do we know if these are voting San Mateo City residents, or do we just, know that they're local?
Yeah, no, they in order to even have a chance to be part of our sample, you need to be a registered voter within the city, and B, based on when you registered to vote, as well as what elections you've taken advantage of or participated in since that point, to demonstrate a pattern of behavior that we would expect would also result in you casting a ballot in the upcoming November election. And then once we send out invitations, every one of those invitations has a hyperlink in it. The hyperlink is unique to that respondent. And so that only people who were part of our randomly selected sample and were sent that invitation can access the site, and they can complete it one time only. So we don't have a situation where someone might say, oh, this is a great survey and I want, my 100 best friends to take it. Let me forward my invitation to them. It doesn't work that way. They can't access the site. So we're confident that these individuals are residents, they're registered voters, and they have demonstrated in the past a pattern of participation that would line up with them casting ballots this November.
Thank you. That's fantastic. That makes me feel more confident in the results too, just knowing that they have been vetted. Second question, and I'm not leaning towards bond, but the bond measure is only paid by property owners. Is that accurate?
Yes. So bond is a levy on property.
So does that mean that bond votes can only be voted by property owners, or is it open to the general public?
Yeah, no, this is, even though it's only a tax on property, same thing as the parcel tax is, right? It's a tax on property. It is voted on by anyone who's a registered voter who cares to participate in the election can cast ballots on it. All right. So you don't have to be a property owner to vote on a bond. It's just like every other voter decided measure. You just have to be a registered voter.
Makes sense. Thank you. And then I want to talk about the use it or lose it question. So if the sales tax, we go to the sales tax, we have for the city of San Mateo a 1/4 cent. If the county were to put up a competing measure and go after that 1/4%, would, again, every voter in San Mateo County be able to weigh in on if the city of San Mateo has to pay the other 1/4 cent to the county, or is it still exclusive to the people who would be paying the additional tax?
So any tax measure that's on the ballot that would be for the city of San Mateo, like this 1/4 cent sales tax we just discussed here, that is only decided on by voters in your city, right? So you get to decide the fate of that measure. The point of the use it or lose it issue is that, perhaps in a future election, the county of San Mateo decides that they want to put a 1/4 cent sales tax on the ballot for some other region-wide purpose. If that passes countywide, it doesn't matter if it passes within the city of San Mateo, but if countywide that measure passes, that 1/4 cent is going to apply across the board. And at that point, that 1/4 cent increment has been taken up, right? It's been used. You as a city would no longer have the ability to go do your own 1/4 cent because you're up against the cap.
Okay. And do we know how many of the cities and towns in the county are not at their fully capped sales tax rate?
I don't know that offhand.
There's probably, I don't want to guess, but I know that there's, from counting from my memory, there's at least 5 or 6 that are already at their ceiling. And so you're seeing that, there's potential of a regional measure passage. They had to get special legislation to go above the ceiling for that. And so that's what preserves the opportunity for our city to still be able to go after that quarter cent. At some point down the line, though, it's like the county had Measure K pass. That was their sales tax, right? If the county comes in the future wanting a sales tax again, say a quarter cent, then that will go, that's, it's estimated that it would generate about 7 million annually. That would go to the entire county, not to San Mateo within the city limits.
And county voters would be voting to take
To tax on.
from the
yes.
city of San Mateo.
Well, sharing it amongst all the cities, right?
Yep.
Yep.
Thanks for clarifying. And then I did hear something which is interesting, but have we accounted for the idea that we may be losing 10 to 20% of our sales tax with the loss of them all? Is that something we've accounted for, and what would be the offset of that? Do we know?
So we're going to be doing an economic analysis and study as part of the project, and it will analyze what that means overall for the city with the new project itself. And at that point in time, we'll be able to better understand. But just in general, overall, if you look at cities across California right now, sales tax is remaining flat or slightly lower than what has been typically on average. And so we're experiencing the same thing here. The city, though, is limited on what revenue generating measures that we have. And so that's why when we look at just the different revenue measure options, the sales tax or the geo bond were the two that were the most viable in terms of vehicles in order to generate revenue in this for this organization, in order to provide essential services to our community. And that's something that I want to be able to speak to, is that should we not receive additional revenue, we're working on a financial sustainability plan, but the result is that we're going to have to take a look at our city services and how we provide those now and into the future.
So,
Sorry, Councilmember Newsom. Would it be all right if we asked other council members?
yeah,
to
can
ask
I
questions?
just finish on one? Just my last follow-up to that was the 7 million number that we forecasted. Is that based on a slight deviation or a slight lowering of last year's, for example, or is it based on last year's number?
So what we do is with the structural deficit, what we do here is to be financially prudent as a city organization. We do a 10-year forecast, really taking a long-term look at our future revenues. And every year for the next 10 years, the city is forecasted to have the $5 to $7 million structural budget deficit with rising costs for services, just like everybody's experiencing throughout the nation, and costs of services keep going up overall. And so that's something that we as a city organization are having to deal with as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, sir. Yes, Deputy Mayor Fernandez.
A couple of questions for Finance Director Visser. Sorry about the back and forth, Abby. I'm sorry. My first question is, usually in years past when we've had deficits or gone through challenging budgetary times, we have been able to count on backfill through grants from the federal and state government. Can you advise on the chances of that occurring to sort of backfill this deficit?
I guess in terms of, I don't know that's been a large part of how we have backfilled in the past. I think we have done a lot of belt tightening.
Sure.
And kind of relied on special revenue sources. But I do know that's something that we're working on now more aggressively probably than we have in the past. So, but I think the city.
So I would just say that the grants typically are utilized for one-time funding sources. There may be some carve-outs, I would say, with our police department, where we are able to use DOJ, Department of Justice grants, to be able to help us on an ongoing source of income. What we have done previously, or the last 2 years, is we're tapping into our reserves in order to get us through these lean times. And so with the city of San Mateo, when you really look at just the revenues overall as a city, when the economy is well, and we really rely on home sales here in this community because we have a real property transfer tax. We are the only city in San Mateo County who has a real property transfer tax. But, we're seeing historic lows in the volume of home sales in this community. Well, we're seeing that in the nation, actually, because of the high cost of interest for homes. And so with that, when the interest rates are lower and the housing market is hot, the city then generates more revenue. And what we've had is, financially prudent city councils, this current city council and management overall to be able to store up reserves so that we can get through a lot of these lean times. But when we look at the forecast, we're still 5 to 7 million looking down on structural deficit for the next 10 years. And our reserves can get us, get us by for the next few years, but we really have to, look at how do we get out of that structural deficit. And so what we've presented over the past year, we're working on a multi-pronged financial sustainability plan, and this is one of the many initiatives that we're looking at. In addition to like what you were saying about grant funding sources, looking at our real property, we have a bunch of mechanisms that we're looking at generating revenue overall.
Okay. And fully advising the fact that you are not psychic, but just given the tenor of the situation of what we've encountered with our CDBG funds, is it unlikely that we would get any federal supplements outside of law enforcement funds?
So depending on the grant terms, it's really going to be, it's limited because of what they have put into the terms itself, that the city cannot align its work with what the federal government's terms are. And so what we're actually looking at is alternative funding sources right now to support our most vulnerable members of our community, to provide essential services to them as well. And so we're not, this current year, right now we have staff putting a proposal together because we can't tap into those federal funds this year, where we're going to have to dip into potentially our reserves in order to float, because it is essential services to our most vulnerable community members.
Okay. And I believe that the state is also suffering from a multi-billion-dollar deficit. Is that accurate?
That is correct.
So is it unlikely that we'd be getting any state funding beyond what we've gotten recently?
So the state actually has taken funding away. So the vehicle license fee is one great example of that this year, where the city is owed by state law to get at least its full recovery of its VLF fee. And so we were shorted by $2.25 million in this last fiscal year. And now in the governor's recently released budget, I doubt that there's a line item for VLF funding for the city. And that's an additional $7 million deficit that we would look at. We were receiving those revenues over the last 20 years up until last year, and that spigot has turned off now because they're not meeting their legal obligations to the 20 cities and the county of San Mateo.
And my last question, to Abby or to Alex. Have we taken any, this is beyond just the item ahead of us right now, but have we taken any action with or discussions with any of our legislative representatives about increasing? Do we know the process for increasing our tax capacity?
So an overall ceiling, you're talking about
ceiling.
exceeding the ceiling itself? It would take special legislation, and in talking with our legislative consultant, it's a big deal to be able to get above that cap. Right now, we still have ceiling, and so we still have a quarter cent here, and so that's why we're focused on that. But I know other cities have looked into, like a good example is South San Francisco was looking at options of how you could look at that in years past. I don't know where they're at now, but just overall, that's the other, only other route in order to increase your ceiling for sales tax here.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Abby. Thank you, Alex.
Councilmember Diaz-Nash.
Thank you, through the mayor. I'll try and be quick. These are largely for Tim. And number one, as part of your presentation, was I clear in understanding that there was a possibility to do a follow-on poll so that when we know the real environment closer to the summer of what other sales taxes or bond measures may be up, we can go back and take the temperature then?
Yeah, so the idea would be that probably springtime, early summer, before council would have to make an official decision about whether to place a measure on the ballot, you'd have what's called a tracking survey. And that would give us up-to-date information in that moment in time, in that climate. We would also, at that point, have a much better idea about what other measures might be sharing the ballot with you. And so we can also build that into the poll, so we have some sense of what the sort of, to the extent that it's sort of a competitive landscape, how that would play out in the poll. We could build that into the study. So that is the idea. So this wouldn't be the last piece of information from your voters that you'd be seeing in terms of their assessment of what a sales tax might look like.
Great, thank you. That's good news because it would be a much more realistic environment. My second question is, in reading through the research, is it a very, very high-level generalization to say that the respondents tended to be more positive about immediate services like public safety or filling potholes, and they weren't as predisposed to putting money up to fix buildings, which were in general not quite as immediate to their lives?
Yeah, you kind of have a mix of things with the results here, but you are correct that what we normally find when we're doing these types of studies is that voters will gravitate towards services more so than facilities themselves. That said, streets and roads, which everyone drives on and gets to experience every day, if you have needs there, those tend to be kind of high level. And then the other is there is a growing awareness in the public about infrastructure, right, in general, and the importance of taking care of that. And so when I looked at these, one of the nice things about the sales tax option is it allows you to address both services as well as capital needs and infrastructure, whereas a bond is strictly infrastructure. And so you can't really deal with some of those service priorities that your voters had.
Thank you. And my last question, in looking at the key objections, the first was taxes are already too high. Number 2, a fear of money being mismanaged. And number 3, I need more information. That last one, needing more information, could I interpret that as an opportunity that with appropriate public education on this potential measure, that there could be opportunity to increase the support?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, what that is oftentimes, that question of, for those who are no or not sure on the measure at the initial ballot test, we ask them why. And when somebody says, well, I'm just not ready to vote yes because I just need more information and I want to know more about what the needs are, how this money is going to be used, et cetera, that is an opportunity, certainly.
Great. Thank you. Those are all my questions.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate the questions that have been asked so far. I did just want to check to see if there were any more. Okay, great. I feel like I've heard some concerns over trying to raise funds when it may not be completely necessary, when there may be additional costs related to the raising of those funds, and concerns about sales tax as it exists in our city today and perhaps in our future. But I heard also some facts being shared through our city staff about the current deficit we're experiencing and some of the volatility in our budget and what we can expect in our future. Given this, I just wanted to go around the room and ask folks to let me know and the folks, the community know what they would like to consider among these options. I think the good news about having 4 options is that you can pick one, and you can maybe give a brief comment or two as to your reasoning. And would anyone like to go first? Yes, council members for your dates.
I'm in favor of supporting option 1, which is the sales tax measure. I think it's critical that we keep essential services, and it sounds like we're going to continue to be in a structural deficit where that's at risk. And if we want to keep the status quo, that means we have to invest back in the community. I would like us to kind of explore for the broader infrastructure needs, that $323 million on deficit that we have for capital infrastructure, perhaps coming back in 2028 with something. But for now, I think we should focus on closing the existing deficit, so I'm in favor of option 1.
Thank you. Councilmember Newsom.
I am also in favor of option 1. I think as Councilmember Swarko-Kadiki said, that we could look at a bond measure for the future, but I think for the 2026, we should move forward with outreach and education for one.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor Fernandez.
I am also in favor of option one. As someone who's serving on the ballot measure committee with Councilmember Swarko-Kadiki, we got to see all of these options and in real time as the polling was happening with the different options. And I don't think that any elected official wants to tax the people, especially during an economic downturn. But this is a really challenging time, and there are basic services that many folks need in the city. So unfortunately, we have to occasionally choose that option, and so I will be continuing to support option one.
Thank you. Councilmember Diaz-Nash.
I also will support option one and agreeing with my other council members, but also adding the fact that sales tax gives us an opportunity to get revenue from visitors and people who are not just members of the city. So it helps to spread the burden a little bit more.
Thank you very much. Yes.
To the mayor, I also just want to make one comment. Sales tax does not include certain things like medications.
So prescription drugs and groceries are carve-outs.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. I, too, will join the other council members in supporting option one at this time. And I do agree with those who have shared interest in reconsidering revenue options in the future. I do appreciate the public comment, indicating that each time we do this, it does cost some money. But I do believe that the situation can change, and each time we look at it, though some of the metrics may appear similar, it's important whenever we consider going ahead with a ballot measure, of course, which would require more expense to make sure we have the best knowledge and information available, and so it may just be a necessary cost to make sure we're making the best decisions we can. As others have mentioned, I do think it's important to shore up our budget when in an environment with significant volatility. We have an opportunity here to ask our community, and again, I just want to reiterate that we're exploring something that will go before the public, and the voters will decide what happens here. But we can ask our community for something that helps us ensure that we can weather future budgetary storms and continue to provide high-quality services and maintain them properly in good times and in lean. The city manager mentioned having a 10-year forecast, and I think this helps. This has the potential to give us a better chance to plan our budgets for multiple years at a time without feeling as though we may be in an emergency every year. And the use it or lose it phrase, I think, is just another reason to consider that, because this may be a limited opportunity to focus money that we may find ourselves spending anyway in the future toward more local services. And another comment?
Just adding on what you're saying, Mayor, I think the public needs to know that we're not just sitting here moaning the fact that we're losing money from the state, but that we are part of an active lawsuit with all the other cities in the county suing to get our VLF funds. So we are fighting very proactively for that money as a long-term foundation for our city. And also, I think it would be very important to address concerns that the public has raised, that this, if any sales tax measure were to pass, there would be a very strong oversight component of it, like with Measure S, where there would be a committee that would look and see how is the money being spent, so that it aligns with what, if voters do vote for it positively, where that money aligns with what they want.
Thank you for that. Mr. Rada.
Have the direction we need.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you all.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes.
Recess till next meeting?
Yes, well,
Thank you, Tim.
that is our one item from the study session. And City Clerk, I think you noted that we may need a little extra time given our venue.
Yeah, we might need about 10 minutes just to switch over. We have a couple of extra hoops to jump through to prepare ourselves for the regular meeting. So if we could resume in 10 minutes, that would be greatly appreciated.
Very good. In that case, let us do that.